Hi there. My name is Dr. Ali Mushtaq, and I'm an LGBT entrepreneur.
Hello, Out Bosses. Rhodes Perry here, and welcome to this week's episode of The Out Entrepreneur, a weekly podcast where I get to interview today's most inspiring LGBTQ bosses crushing it in business. On this week's episode, we are welcoming Dr. Ali Mushtaq, who is joining us all the way from sunny Orange County, California. How are you doing today? Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm doing excellent. How are you?
I am great. I'm wishing that I was where you are because I think we're supposed to get snow or something this weekend in October. So anyway, that's it. Up here in Portland, Oregon. So anyway, for folks who are not familiar with Dr. Ali Mushtaq, he is the founder of Getting Wolfie, a consulting firm that empowers market researchers to inclusively collect data while overcoming personal biases. He delivers his consulting services to also help communities within media, journalism, and even for online content creators like podcasters like me and YouTube channel curators. Ali earned his PhD in sociology from UC San Francisco and his master's in demography at UC Irvine. He is currently co-authoring a book on Black women AIDS activists that will be published by Lexington Press in 2021. So lots of amazing things that you're up to and that you've done. Ali, I would love to, just out of curiosity to kick the interview off, tell me more about the origin story of how you named your business Getting Wolfie.
So I named my business Getting Wolfie because, I've always kind of looked pretty feral. So I just sort of associated myself with that sort of image of like the animal who's pretty who's known to be this kind of deviant, but also is somewhat empowered as well to the point where they're able to kind of like go against the grain. So I thought that was just my attempt at being quote unquote edgy, and it just kind of stuck.
I love it. It's memorable. And I'm sure when people first get to meet you and they see your business card, or I don't know how we network these days in virtual land, but I'm sure that that's a good conversation starter. And it's in alignment with who you are, right? So let's talk more about your consulting business origin story. So how did you get started, and how has your work changed since you first said, I'm in business?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because, in general, I've always been interested in two main things, social justice and things like sociology and things like inequality. So I guess three. But basically, my entire life professionally, I've always been an academic, specifically a college professor. And I was thinking that maybe the academic route might not be necessarily for me, simply because in academia, there's a lot of limits in terms of the questions that we're seeking to ask and the amount of impact that we're able to get. So, for example, I might be able to do a study, but it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody who's in policy or somebody who's in business might be able to quickly take those results and apply it. So I thought that a sort of avenue I could explore is to take those interests in terms of how I want to promote equality and equity issues and turn it into a business in a way for people to actually use the information in order to actually better people's lives.
I love that. It's like you're almost a translator of sorts, like research literacy of, you can translate what's going on in the academy and actually make it actionable for your clients in a way that I wish more people were out there doing what you're doing, because it sounds like it's really effective and it's innovative, right? I was reading through your website, and you generously share your personal history of growing up in a conservative part of California. And then you share like this pivotal moment of moving to San Francisco for grad school, and it allowed you to embrace your real self, right? So could you share more about how your own lived experiences were motivating factors to build out your consulting firm, and bringing yourself into the work you do every day?
Oh, absolutely. So basically, I grew up in Orange County, and for those who might be unfamiliar with the area, Orange County tends to be the more conservative part of Southern California. So, because when everybody thinks California, they think it's super liberal and progressive, and this area typically tends to be very conservative. So I grew up in this area during 9/11. So I was in junior high when it happened. And so during this sort of period where the country was changing, basically I noticed that like people would do things and like they would say things to me, like they would call me a terrorist and all these kinds of things. So what would end up happening was slowly I was realizing like that wasn't okay. And then specifically when I also started to notice other things about myself. So in addition to me not liking forms of discrimination, it was also issues of me and my sexual orientation. So I was also noticing that I was just different than most people, and not just different in the way that like, you're like the high school weirdo different, but you're also there's something else different about you. And it happened to be my sexual orientation. And so interestingly, I started to realize I was part of the LGBT community. And then at 15, I came out to my overwhelmingly conservative high school. So I remember it was junior year, and I basically just decided I'm going to come out. And it was interesting because once I started reconciling my sexuality with who I was, I noticed that like my grades started to increase. So like I went from like, a sort of okay average student to a student that was making honor roll pretty much every semester. So it was really interesting to see that effect on the way that my grades were starting to come out. And then not only that, but it was even my teachers would say that too. They're like, well, how did you go from this student to this student in this short amount of time? And it's like, well, because maybe I was being honest with who I was. And then what happened was I started to sort of take up the cause of social justice. So incidentally, I hung out with people that were very like gender positive and sex positive with things early on for that particular time, where they did focus on trans issues and things on being allowed to embody notions that were not heteronormative. And so that sort of lended me to sort of wanting to form our GSA, which is called the Gay Straight Alliance. And basically, me and a couple other students took it up onto ourselves in order to start one to provide a safe space for people that were LGBT and their allies within that particular context. Now, it was interesting because, again, like I fought vociferously against a very conservative high school, because what happened was they would liken the GSA to starting an abortion club. So, yeah, so basically, yeah, so that's the way they saw this. And so hopefully, I left all my materials there, so I don't know what the school is doing now. But at the same time, at least I was able to provide that visibility. And later on, that would then translate into the activism and the work I would do later on as a college student and grad student, and later on as faculty at universities. But then also, it then translated into the way I do business. So, yeah.
It was such a rich response. I just was taking notes. And, I think like what's really powerful in your story is at 15, you knew who you were, right? And despite growing up in a really conservative area, you were able to kind of stand in your own power and say who you were. And that sounds really scary. The fact that it was a pretty conservative junior high and what sounded like a conservative high school, and you were still able to kind of find other folks who are LGBTQ and say, we're starting a GSA, and you were challenging the administration. And like, isn't it interesting that, the work that you were doing was good for you, good for your classmates, and actually really good for the school. So you're doing all of this emotional labor, and there is still so much resistance. I would be curious to see, what that school is doing now, given that so many young people have a completely different relationship to gender and to sexual orientation, so thank you for doing that work. And like another thing that popped up for me as you were speaking is thinking like a good friend of mine does consulting work, and she's a trans woman, and she shares often, I didn't choose this work chose me, like kind of saying like, it was out of necessity to do the work, but at the same time, it was in alignment with her purpose. And I'm curious, like, does that ring true for you? Do you feel like because of who you are, all of your skills, being academic and, having like a really niche skill around, market research and demographics, that things disaligned when you started to your own business? Or or does it not? Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting question, simply because it's like, yeah, I do believe in this idea that the work chose me in a way. That's actually, yeah, because it's almost like, I mean, I feel like when we do exist on the margins, even if you are in the LGBTQ community, or if you happen to be of color, or any gender minority, et cetera, like, I feel like in general, it's about this sort of notion that somehow like the table will come to you and people will automatically invite you. And it's almost like, growing up, and when you have the experiences that you do, especially as a gender minority or a sexual minority or someone of color, like you learn that like these spaces don't necessarily exist for you. Like, for example, like your work and like providing visibility with certain ideas that, we need to be gender inclusive. Like, it's not something that it should be revolutionary, but rather it's for some reason people fight against it. Just as, for example, with my work, like just the idea that, it's okay to be of color, it's okay to be queer within these spaces. And simply that it's not that you're detracting from business, but rather you're adding something, but other people can't see that. Right. And I think that sort of comes down to the conversation of like the work chooses you, because it's like, well, how can I make these working conditions work for me? And it's like, in general, for me, like I do exist in a space where, I feel like culturally and socially, like, I know I have a couple strikes against me. Like, I feel like, it's my obligation, quote unquote, to help make these spaces more inclusive for other folks. Because it's like, like I have people from India, I have people from Dubai and other places tell me like, yeah, I might be living in the situation where I'm actually not in the West and I'm dealing with very oppressive conditions. But at the same time, like this story helps me kind of understand what the possibilities could be. So just giving other people the possibilities and being able to be like, hey, like you can have a workplace that won't suck and that you don't hate going to on a daily basis, just knowing that a little bit, especially since we all spend so much time with work, so much of our lives revolve around work. And then the idea that, that work doesn't have to be this exploitative process, but rather it's a creative process. I think that's very important. And I think that people like us that are involved in this, we're trying to make the world safe for people to basically just exist.
Yeah, exist and, be able to show up as your real self. And not that everyone needs to understand everything about you, but to be open to say, hey, it's great that you're on our team. You add so much, like so many different dimensions that we wouldn't see. And together, like we can create something really powerful that if we were just doing it on our own, like that's the idea of creative work and innovative work. And go ahead.
And it's like, when does that line of like the dredge becomes creative? I mean, when we think about the literature that talks about capitalism and stuff like that, it's like, yeah, work is, we can talk about the labor force being this exploitative construct, or we could talk about this labor force that allows us to create and for all of us to not only be consumers, but also producers at the same time. And I think that when we're focusing on this idea of being an LGBT business entrepreneur, it's like, we're dealing with conditions where we know that, we know that there's certain parameters that if we weren't on our own, then we would have to deal with certain issues. So I feel like when we are engaging in these spaces, we're actually giving a chance for other people. We're starting work, basically we're creating space for other people to work and to be their authentic selves. And then hopefully we're able to sort of affirm their value as producers as opposed to just simple consumers.
Yes.
So, and I think that when we're focusing on the idea of consumers, it's like, and I get it, we live in a generation where, people are oppressed by debt. They have, these 9-to-5 jobs and like, we're still not making ends meet. And I think that, and it really forces us to sort of rethink about like how we do work. What should that work look like? And, does work have to be this bad thing? And so the way I'm looking at it is that work can be not only productive, but it could also be empowering. And I think that when we're focusing on this empowering dimension, it's like, yeah, by giving space to those individuals, yeah, we are then able to then, give people the sort of means through which they can survive. And then so when they're also happier, they can be more productive, they can love what they do, as opposed to, this idea of like, crap, I have to go to work every morning. But then I guess going back to your colleague's point, like it's just this idea that, it's about you being able to express yourself.
Yes, 100%. And you are self-actualized, you are expressing yourself, and as you build your business, that's very clear. You had mentioned your background is in the academy, and you're kind of on that track for a little bit. Talk to us about the moment where you were like, this whole academic track, like you said, it was limiting in certain ways, and then when you saw what more you could do with the skills that you had from the academy, plugging them into your business, like how was that received with people in your inner circle, with your colleagues in the academy, when you told them you were going off in this direction?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, I mean, several things were happening. I mean, on one end, the person that I'm co-writing the book with, basically one of my mentors, she left basically she had 2 tenure track jobs, and that basically means essentially job security. And she left it for a job in a hospital. And essentially she does work, administrative work, and that she loves. But then the idea is just that, you're able to be, you're actually, well, for her thing, it was about teaching me how to value what I do and actually to put value on what I do. But I think the moment for me was also just this realization that at the end of the day, I'm working within structures that weren't amenable for me. So for example, in general, the reason why I'm self-employed is because I want to be able to basically help people on my terms. So I want to be able to be yeah, I'm this out gay dude and I have a sexuality. I'm not going to apologize for it. And I mean, there's certain situations where if you had a student, for example, look you up and be like, oh my God, this person's doing this kind of stuff. It's oh, well, then suddenly that means that my work could be compromised. My ability to actually make ends meet could be compromised. And I mean, I've had situations where, even though I am an academic, I'm a published researcher, I've, taught for 10 years in both research methods and both other substantive issues. I've had a situation where, they're like, well, my professor is this perverted leather person who, should not be talking about these subjects because he's just trying to indoctrinate us. And yes, I've actually had this before. Yeah, and it's interesting because in the way that the institution reads that is oh, well, they're bad for business, as opposed to, oh, well, maybe there might be some aspects of this that might be discriminatory. So and so I think that when we're looking at this idea of being able to be self-employed, it's well, look, it's at the end of the day, I am who I am. I am this, I am somebody of color. I am somebody who identifies as LGBT. But at the same time, I'm also a skilled sociologist that's able to, number crunch, and at the same time, understand interview data and learn how to collect it and process it. So, I mean, it's there are different aspects of me. And for me, I'm just sick and tired of having to compartmentalize those people. Ali the sociologist is the same person as Ali the influencer. So I'm the same person. Not only that, but it's I suddenly I don't forget all of my skills and grounded theory just because I take off my shirt. So I think that contributes to how I see myself and my business, because it's for me and my brand, I want to give people results, and I want to do it in a way where we're not sugarcoating it. So it's look, if your respondents think that your corporation is anti-Black, you need to know this. Yeah. Because that'll affect your bottom line, that'll affect your ability to market, and even not just with with Black communities, but also with white communities that actually care. So I mean, this is actually something where it's these issues not only affect us all, but it's I'm able to communicate how and why and what we can do to fix that.
Yeah.
So I'm and in general, who I am has nothing to do with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I was asking the question because, as entrepreneurs, anyone, right? When you are doing a thing and all of a sudden you decide, hey, I'm going in a different direction, even though the through line is you are you, right? You're still reintroducing yourself to all of your colleagues and peers to say, hey, remember me, Ali, as the academic. I still have all of that grounded theory, right? And all that good stuff. And I'm going to take everything that I know and start this business, and it takes a while for people to have that beat of oh, wait, Ali is not at this university teaching anymore, or maybe you are, but you're doing this business full time. And I think that for us LGBTQ plus folks, right? we know that story really well. We know the story of like, whether it's parents or, close friends, when you come out, if you've come out, like you are reintroducing yourself in a different way, even though you are still you, right? And so, I say that simply because there's a lot of folks that listen to this podcast who are LGBTQ and are thinking about starting a business. So it's like you've already done this thing before, and I would say, coming out, into your rainbow fabulousness sometimes can be more challenging than, that act of like getting the motivation, the momentum, to start your business. So we've got those skills. And I just want to like highlight that. And I think like your journey is a really important example of how that works. Right. So thank you for sharing a little bit about that. I wanted to kind of ask you, thinking about where you are today in your business and when you first got started, like just first thinking about it, what might you do different from where you're at now based on what you know, that you could kind of share some of that knowledge with your younger self on, hey, you should do this one thing before we get started?
Yeah, I actually would tell my younger self that like at least, or myself at least 5 or 6 years ago, to like start earlier.
Yeah, right. Yes. Don't wait. Yeah.
Don't wait. Because I know in general that things seem scary. It's like, wow, like, you're going to leave a job that guarantees your income, but for something that's very transient, or that could be very transient. But at the same time, it's like, the rewards are so much better. I mean, especially, I'm saying this as somebody whose business is in its infancy, but at the same time, it's like, I feel like I would, if I had known that I could do this for myself and in a way where, where if I had known and actually trusted my ability to do this on my own, then I feel like I would be much emotionally and mentally happier 3 or 4 years ago than, having to like slug it out and have to wait for the academic job market, because in general, being an academic is pretty difficult. Like, to get the job in the first place, and that's it's really hard. So like, I think the ASA, the American Sociological Association, only posted like 45 job offers in the entire country. So, and at that point, I just kind of was like, you know what, I'm just not thinking that this is the best route. Simply because, again, like, I feel like there's so many people that could use these skills, and especially since a lot of us are thinking about like these questions now, given certain events that are happening in society. So for example, the idea that we're realizing that we need to be racially aware, we need to be culturally aware about things like pronouns, we need to learn how to ask questions in ways that are not offensive, or but at the same time, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask questions in the first place. It's just, how do we do that, without having to offend anybody? But I think that like, when we're sort of thinking about these issues, it's like, I think the context also in which that sort of created this urgency and this need really kind of asked us to really think about, who are we as people? Like, are we okay with or are we okay with forms of inequality that just completely mean dehumanizing people? And I think that, especially with some folks that are, thinking about starting businesses for themselves, it's like, am I entitled to my own humanity? Am I entitled to my own happiness? Because I think for so long, a lot of us are thinking like, maybe we weren't. And so, or like, maybe this is just normal to accept having a boss just like, making us come in at odd hours and putting us in situations that we don't feel comfortable in. And it's like, well, no, it's like, we need to think about like, how much time we have on this planet, and how much time that we really want to sort of affirm the fact that we have lives and they matter.
Yes. So. Yes. As you were talking, I was just thinking like unplugging from the matrix. That was something that like kind of just popped in my mind, because I feel like that's what that feeling, when you realize like you can do this. And, when you're thinking about your younger self, like start earlier, because there's something about, the like working for someone else is, like you said, there's the illusion of stability. There's the illusion of this paycheck that's coming at whatever increments it's coming at, but it is just an illusion. And I think what many folks, maybe some people who are listening right now, realize like in COVID land is like lots of, jobs are going away, layoffs are happening. So it's like, what skills do you have right now that you provide as an offering to help someone else out, and that are in alignment with who you are, that, like you said, like you can show up to your own job that you created and be yourself and actually attract clients that want to work with you because they like you, they trust you, and they know that you're going to do good work. I mean, that's right. And then that's when you get into that creator mode that you were talking about. So there's so much power to it.
Oh, absolutely. And even before COVID, it was just like, like for our contracts were sort of a semester by semester basis. So like every 4 months I could easily be unemployed. So, and I'm basically just depending on, and I was like 1 or 2 bad reviews away from like losing my job, and every adjunct knows this. And like slowly I'm noticing that like my friends that are like hired on a contract basis in the academic universe, they're realizing it too. So it's like, they're realizing that like, wow, like, a student, like one student that's either homophobic or racist or sexist can ruin my day. And not only ruin my day, but also ruin my livelihood. And that's pretty much how it is now. And especially even those with like tenure track jobs, I mean, they are also slogging out in environments where not only are you dealing with that end, but then you're also dealing with the tenure process where like, if somebody doesn't like your research because you focus on gender issues, race issues, or other kinds of issues, like suddenly, you don't get job security and you're forced to do everything over again. I mean, there are countless cases of people, specifically women of color, that exist in these sort of high-end institutions, and like they don't get tenure because they are promoting research that focus on intercultural behavior and all those kinds of aspects of existence. So it's like they're seen as, oh, well, you're not publishing in prestigious journals. And then it's like, even that case is just like, well, why are the journals not publishing us? Oh, that's because, your sample size is too small. It's like, well, yeah, because if there's only like maybe, people, if you're studying, let's just say people of color in the leather world, there's only so many of them that you can get access to. So I mean, it's like, and again, like you find the institutional barriers there. So, I mean, there are multiple ways in which, even within these sort of stable, quote unquote, jobs, it's like, you're not able to sort of reap your own reward. So it's like, well, why not then sort of be able to control it? And I think that this degree of control allows me to not only help other people, but it also helps me to be myself.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how I just see it.
Yeah. I was just thinking, not related to my next question, but just when you're talking about, women of color not getting tenure in universities because of research, right? And I mean, this is beyond women of color, right? But people that are focusing in right now around looking at white supremacy culture or systemic racism, and you've got the White House that just issued an executive order banning trainings for federal agencies, staff at federal, but also federal contractors. So, I know many colleges and universities receive federal dollars. So it's going to be like, how does that impact research? I mean, hopefully this is short term and we don't have to worry about this for too long, but it does create like a lot of other questions that aren't necessarily related for now, but I would love to talk with you offline about that, because it's this, it adds just extra barriers, that prevents people, like you said, that limits you from doing what the kind of research that you're skilled at doing, right? So I want to talk about one of your specialties, which is working with content creators like podcasters like me around inclusive interviewing for diversity. So I'd love to hear more about what that means to you. And then also like, what's one thing that most podcast hosts don't know about interviewing, but ought to?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because I think in general, like there are folks that do care about diversity and equity issues, as we were sort of talking about. Of course, we're one of them. but the idea is that, sometimes, we don't know how to ask questions. Sometimes we don't feel comfortable asking these questions. Sometimes we feel like, maybe if we say the wrong thing, we're going to have to self-censor, or maybe like, we just don't know where the work is done in this area. So suddenly we might say things that might seem common sense. So there's a lot of things that can come up. And like, for me, I want to help remove that uncomfortability. I want to make people feel comfortable talking about diversity issues, because, I've done a lot of work with the press, including the New York Times and a whole bunch of other folks. And, I've noticed that in general, it's like there are folks that want to talk about diversity, but again, like not everybody has the tools in order to sort of address that. And that's and so basically what I do is I help podcasters, YouTube artists, content creators, and other folks that involve interviewing in order to kind of, help adjust their skills in order to get better at essentially producing content that focuses on diversity. So, and the approach that I take is based on social scientific techniques and methods, which is the grounded theory approach, which is basically something that we as sociologists are trained in, but at the same time, like we haven't necessarily taken that approach to the way that we form and shape media. And basically what it involves is basically assuming that the world is sort of this blank slate around you and being able to tease out that blank slate without actually having to know what that world is. So not only can you actually not have to know about the communities you're talking to, but you can also actually being able to get a very rich and detailed picture about how you actually, how your guests and how they're actually shaping the world. Yeah. So that's sort of where this business idea comes from. And so in my line, what I do is I, develop workshops for people in podcasting, YouTube, and other avenues that involve interviewing in order to sort of tease that out. And I also work with content creators one-on-one as well.
That is so valuable. And I've been in podcast land for a while myself, and I consumed podcasts for a lot longer than before I got started. And are your skills really needed for sure. So I hope that people find you. And, I definitely would encourage you, if you haven't gone to the podcast movement, and this is for anyone tuning in right now, they have a lot of programming around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So there's definitely space for you. And I don't see this kind of offering, like workshop wise or, online offerings available. So I love what you're doing. I think it's really needed. And I think it's a game changer for, like you said, for folks that, want to talk more about all things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And like you said, are just deathly afraid of saying the wrong thing or not doing it right, quote unquote. And then they do nothing, right? And then in terms of shaping culture, or trying to make it a little bit healthier or more inclusive, like it's lost because people just are afraid of that gotcha moment or being called out. And
yeah, and I think this goes back to the way that we think about race and all these other issues in general. It's just like, oh, well, like, I don't want to be told I'm racist. I don't want to be told I'm prejudiced. Or no, I wasn't raised that way. Or no, I'm not a Trump supporter, but or I'm not somebody who's, actively, using, certain derogatory languages. But at the same time, am I, why is it that I'm not able to ask these questions? And again, it's because of the way that we're socialized. It's the way we're taught to think about color blindness. And it's basically the way that we're not necessarily, being able to sort of really address problems. Like, for example, somebody would say, well, why are you not talking to people of color? It's like, oh, because they're not there, right? You hear that argument, like they're not there. And it's like, well, wait, I mean, are you looking in the right places? Are you talking to the right people? Are you able to sort of, are you able to hammer out these logistics? And again, like what my program does is it helps people sort of overcome all of these issues. And it really just frankly revolves around their will to get this done. So it really doesn't require any specialized knowledge whatsoever. And it's a skill that can be taught and easily mastered.
Yes, 100%. 100%. I love that. So I want to go into more about you and your connection to our rainbow family. So I first want to ask you, as a newer LGBTQ business owner, have you experienced a time, either running your business now or perhaps working for someone else, where you were underestimated, treated unfairly, or just outright discriminated? And if you can remember like one story, one time, share a little bit about what was going on, and most importantly, how did you work around it? How did you work through it?
Yeah, so it was sort of that experience I mentioned earlier, where, like, for example, like when I was teaching an LGBT class, like I'm basically teaching things like Foucault, Gail Rubin, and the most, it was the most like philosophical understanding of LGBT issues. Period. Yeah. And then you get the eval saying, you get a student saying, oh, well, we saw your social media and we know stuff about you. And then getting the eval saying, oh, well, he's on with porn stars and he's all this, crazy demon who's trying to like indoctrinate us. So yeah, it was kind of a situation where I'm just like, yeah, this is probably not a good idea. And this was in an LGBT class. So it was just like, all right, yeah, I think we're kind of in a situation where it's probably not the best profession.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of confusing too, right? Because I feel like when you're taking a sociology course, right, or the course that you were teaching, LGBTQ
Yeah.
studies, like you would assume people are attracted to learning more because there's like an open mind and and talking about sexual liberation and the history of the movement itself is so much a part of it. So it's like this is just like the movement, right? Like
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm sorry you had to
Well, and like the thing is, like with my classes, like, I'm, in terms of like my skill set, like I'm very skilled with the actual hard skills of research. But in general, when I teach, I love to focus on theory and philosophy.
Yeah.
So this was basically a class that focused on things like philosophy and theory.
Yeah.
So like random people like Foucault, Rubin, reading studies and like thinking about them, like it really had nothing to do with my life as an influencer.
Yeah. And Foucault, it's heavy stuff that like can be applied. I just think of like power. Like when I think of Foucault, I think of like power, like and how power works, right? And maybe it was just too challenging, so they just got petty. But that's that I think like I would crumble, with that kind of personal, like that it was just malicious. It wasn't about how you could like in feedback, usually there's a kernel of like, oh, well, maybe I could do that better. But it was more, it's a personal attack.
Oh yeah, and I mean, basically, like, cause that was actually one of the first few times where I actually like saw my sexual orientation come up as a negative. Because it's like, what is this? Like, is this a sexual orientation thing? Is this a race thing? Is it both? Is it? So it's hard to really pinpoint it. But at the end of the day, like, it really brought me to the realization that, if I'm going to be doing work, I don't want to be in a situation where I'm the negative, like me as a person is the negative. So at that point, I was just like, okay, like I'm just going to go in and just start my business. And especially since I have experience with social media marketing and influencing that I've sort of developed over the years. So, I mean, it's like one of those things where it's like, yeah, I mean, I do this and I do research and I teach. So It is what it is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like, you learned from that just more of, okay, like this is the reality, like that, when you're in the classroom setting, that may happen. It could happen, honestly with clients and, you get closer to, okay, maybe not, at least with clients, like I learned this, and I would prefer working with more of these kind of clients that, lift me up and feed me and, respect me. Right. So thank you for sharing that. It's not easy. I think when you share your story around that for other folks that have been there, it's like, oh, okay, I'm not the only one who's gone through this. And, to see you as an example of like, you're thriving, you've built this business, you're growing it, you're on the path. And the really amazing thing about our communities is like, we want to lift each other up for the most part, and it's like, especially in the business world, it's like, like I can think of some clients right now who could benefit from you, and just like, that's the exchange that we have in the space, or at least with this podcast in our community, that's what we're trying to create, So I think that's like a superpower of our community. But I would love to know from you, just based on your own lived experiences, being a part of the LGBTQ plus, our rainbow family, like what are some lived experiences that come from specifically, being LGBT that you believe allows you to stand out in your work and in business?
So in general, like I think when I was in my, it's like early to mid-ish 20s, I ended up actually involving myself within the leather BDSM community. And then I ended up doing a lot of nonprofit activism. And I did a lot of work basically focusing on racial and sexuality issues, specifically raising awareness about queer Muslims and people of color within these non-traditional spaces. And so I ended up developing a sort of a national, international profile, sort of talking about these issues. And so hence the influencing and the sort of idea of social media marketing, because then what ended up happening was I started doing work that focused on nonprofit work. So, for example, I was a sort of senior officer to a Leathermen of Color group where we focus on HIV/AIDS education, fundraising, and charity work, and also providing a space for people of color. I also did work on sort of the fashion end and the modeling end, where I basically did things like Walk LA Fashion Week. And I'm doing this in the context of, being able to show people in other communities that, yeah, I mean, one, Muslims aren't scary, but two, the idea that we're part of this sort of LGBT tapestry as well. And I think that, like, especially getting feedback from people overseas, so people in South Africa, people in Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, India, places like Australia, and all, like, it's sort of a non-Americanized and Westernized audience. Yeah. Like, they're telling me, like, yeah, I mean, again, even though we're not necessarily able to exercise some of these freedoms, we like the idea that this is at least possible.
Yes.
So I think that, and that's sort of the best I can do, because I myself acknowledge, like, I'm in a situation where I do live in a country that allows me to exercise a part of my sexuality and in a visible way. But at the same time, other people might not necessarily be able to access that. And especially in places like Pakistan, and especially in places like, certain parts of the Middle East, where they can be extremely homophobic and certainly transphobic as well. But again, it depends on which country, of course. But and there's interesting stuff about law in that regard. But in general, though, like, I think that, like, but again, like, in terms of my work, I try to sort of focus on the idea that, yeah, I mean, it's okay to be overtly sexual. It's okay to sort of present this image of, like, you are gay, and that's okay. And so that's sort of where I take in that trajectory of the leather world into that sort of larger platform. And so what I'm able to do is, communicate with people through things like BDSM workshops. So, like, for example, I've had people in India take my BDSM workshop to, like, learn about these things, where they're learning about things like sexual consent, and they're learning about things like safety for the first time. So again, like, they're basically saying that, yeah, even though I'm not in this position, I can still learn about it, or I can still look at it. And that could be enough for now.
Yes. Just on the piece of kind of like in the leather community, the BDSM community, basic things that you're teaching that I wish was kind of universal knowledge for everyone around, consent and, safety, and that, like, there's nothing radical about that, right? Like, you're just there as, giving generously. And those are the two things that I picked up on, is like just kind of the giving, that the volunteerism that you're doing, in the spaces that you're in, as well as showing up and just being you as that possibility model globally. Like, you are a global influencer, and it's simply because you started some social media accounts and you started to share your truth, right? And anyone who's tuning into this, you're probably listening through some kind of device that has podcasts, that you probably have apps that are social media. So you can do this too. Like, if there's something that you have a unique message about your lived experiences, that's a superpower, because there's not enough of our stories out there. And when we think about intersectionality, like, all of the other identities that we carry, in addition to being a part of the LGBTQ community, we're able to influence the spaces that we have access to. And it's about being safe, right? So if you're safe, and your life is protected, then please do it, And if you're not, like, keep listening to shows like this, and keep listening to folks like Ali, who, like, you're living it, you're being you, and that's inspiring, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think it's also important to mention that, just the idea that, again, like, I think that I've also heard little blips of this idea that, again, like, I'm in the West and there's a privilege to that. And it's like, there's a sort of narrative that runs within this idea of, like, oh, well, he's American, therefore he has this idea that being American is the best way, kind of thing. And I feel like especially if you're coming from, a non-Western context, it might read that way. And, to that, it's just like, and I understand that. And it's just, again, all I can do is just be me.
Yeah.
And if my story helps just one person, that's the most important thing.
Absolutely. And it's like, I mean, like, it's hard to, when we talk about our rainbow family, and there's many communities underneath it. So it's like, there's not this monolith. And it's like, even when we think about the US, it's like, I'm sure the international image that's kind of put out is trying to be like, we're great around human rights, and we know the reality that we are far from that, but even just around kind of LGBT inclusion, I mean, you've seen the stark difference just in one state that is assumed, oh, it's California, the most progressive state ever, yet you lived in San Francisco, you're in Orange County now. Those are like two different worlds, right? So it's, yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, Orange County is slowly changing. And it's definitely diversifying, and so
Yeah.
slowly but surely, our culture is starting to reflect that. But at the same time, I mean, it took me to leave my context in order to fully understand and discover who I was. I mean,
Yeah.
literally, the first thing I did after leaving Orange County was go to a Folsom Street Fair. Like that was the first
That's
thing I
awesome.
did. Like a couple of days before classes. It really tells you though that, like, what, I was just given a context where I was allowed to be me. I was exposed to people that sort of, help nurture that. And, for me, like, I want to be that person that helps to nurture that difference and to be like, yeah, it's okay that you're different. You're not harming anybody. You're not doing anything exploitative. You're a good person. And so I just want to be able to affirm that with other people.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So thank you for sharing so much. And I'm bummed because we're coming up towards the end of the interview, but I have a few more questions for you. So one, we're in this world that is really hard for many, 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 many reasons. And so I'm just wondering, from your perspective, what does this moment where we are at right now, and however we're making sense out of it, what does it make possible for LGBTQ entrepreneurs, business owners, that maybe wasn't possible before March of 2020?
I think that in general, I think this moment is sort of getting people to really reckon with basic issues, especially within the LGBTQ community, where you're focusing on things like healthcare and things like, basically being able to guarantee that, like, well, or basically realizing that not everybody's guaranteed healthcare, like, and especially not just on the access issues, like, for example, like, not everybody has access to a job that will give them healthcare, but the idea that, like, for example, things like trans health is something to fight for, because not everybody, we're sort of working with the assumption that, like, oh, like, everybody understands endocrinology, everybody understands how cancer works, everybody understands how the sort of mental health components go along to that. So it's really forcing us to reckon with this idea that, like, yeah, like, maybe these factors that we might have taken for granted before might not necessarily be taken, maybe are things that we shouldn't be taking for granted. And because that's the case, it forces us, especially as entrepreneurs, to provide that, sort of provide those education and provide those services for the people that need it. And especially, like, when you're looking at questions of coronavirus, I mean, there spews a lot of, questions about sexuality, like being able to then express yourself. If you want to express yourself, if you want to be able to then somehow reconcile being in a situation where we live in a pandemic, but also realizing that even in our central institutions, like, so for example, LGBT establishments like bars, coffee houses, et cetera, like, to rethink those, and for entrepreneurs to come in and to figure out alternative ways in terms of connecting. There's a whole bunch of things that we should start to think about as LGBT entrepreneurs, especially if we want to be not only an agent of change, but also to capitalize on the situation as well. Oh, yeah. So, I mean, it's equity equals inclusion equals productivity equals profit. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and it's some ways of gaming capitalism, which, that's a whole other podcast of, like, deconstructing that and making it work for everyone, equity style, and I really like what you're saying. I mean, it sounds like, how do we bust out of isolation when so many of us, even before March, for whatever reasons, we're feeling not understood. Some people might be listening to this. Like, I mean, I grew up in a small town in Florida, right? So there's real isolation physically that's already existed. And, if we're lucky enough to have a strong internet connection, how do we then, now we can build community with people in Dubai, or we can build community with people in South Africa. I mean, it's amazing, but it's also, who does it? How do we create the space? How do we create safety in that space? I mean, there's a lot of questions, and that, like you said, that leaves room for entrepreneurs that are purpose-driven and want to give back in some ways. So, yeah.
Indeed. And it kind of, like you just mentioned, that you grew up in a small rural town in Florida. Like, the LGBT entrepreneurs were responsible for providing that community.
Yeah.
Right, through the bars, through the coffee houses, through the bookstore, right? Yeah. And, like, those spaces are slowly disappearing because they're being wiped out. So again, it then creates an opportunity for other people to figure out ways in which they can then create that community and then, being able to sort of recreate that connection.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Okay. I'm sad. We're almost over. Okay. So thinking about next generation of LGBTQ entrepreneurs, what advice, one piece of advice that you might give them just to take that first leap, to consider, going down the path of starting their own business?
It's scary, but it's it's scary. It's scary, but it's worth it.
Yes. Yeah. It's like the high dive, right? Like you can go all the way up and you can look down and you can always go back down and say no, right? Mm-hmm. But you kind of move through that fear, and by the time you hit the water, you're like, oh, I want to do that again. so hopefully that's the feeling. But yeah, you're totally right. There's fear, but there's nothing, I feel like when you lean into that, there's some magic, once you can kind of get through the fear, and it's always going to be there, right? No matter how long you've been doing it. So,
oh yeah. Yeah. There's always the fear of like, okay, so like, what if my business fails, or like, what if like I run out of resources? But then you have other days where it's like, yeah, I'm trucking along, it's all right, And it's like, I think that what somebody else explained it to me, who was also an entrepreneur. They're like, well, we've been in business for 3 or 4 years now, so so now we're slowly at a place where we can kind of be like, yeah, we're okay. So again, eventually, I don't want to be cliche, but it gets better.
Yeah. That definitely rings true. It does get better. And it's just like the heart, smarts, guts, luck, lots of tenacity and grit. And, if you've got that fire in the belly and why you're doing what you're doing and you're in love with that, then you're on the right path. And, if you're not in love with it, you can always tweak it. And even with failure, that's like, it's a no that can point you into another direction that's going to get you closer to what you're meant to be doing. So,
absolutely. Yeah. Failures are great. It's like that way. It's like if something doesn't work, then you can figure out why, and then you can adjust it.
Totally. Yeah. So Ali, I've loved our conversation, and I'm curious, like the one place that you would love our listeners to go to just to check out more about what you're doing online.
Sure. Check out www.gettingwolfie.com, GETTINGWOLFIE.com.
Sweet. Okay. And that's going to be in the show notes, along with, I think you gave us your Instagram and Twitter and LinkedIn. There's other places where we can find you. So for folks who tuned in today and want to learn more about what Ali is up to, go ahead and check out the show notes. It's at outentrepreneur.com. And thank you. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode. Thank you for listening to us and getting inspired by Ali. That's always a privilege and a pleasure to host you all. And every Tuesday, we're coming at you with a new episode. So be sure to subscribe if you like what you're hearing. Share it with a friend or a loved one if it can help them in their own entrepreneurial pursuits. And until next week, keep showing up as authentically as you want in your work.